Hey guys, in this video we're going to be covering the history and evolution of the Chilean Mauser, underappreciated history of a really fantastic Mauser lineage. And yes, before you ask, this shirt is for sale. On the front is the famous Boer War saying with the Mauser logo on the back. Sales of this shirt does go to help the channel. So to get a better understanding of the Chileans' need for a fine military arm, there was a lot of sort of, you could call it border conflicts in South America, in particular to us, between the Chileans and the Peruvians and the Bolivians. This, culminated in the Pacific War, which Chile came out on the winning side of. And, even though they won the war, there's still a pretty great tension between it and its neighbors. And also there's a pretty big tension with Argentina. Argentina's, the bigger sort of neighbor to the right of Chile, and so they're sort of surrounded by enemies. And this is sort of parallels a bit with sort of like the German mindset. They're kind of in Europe. They were surrounded, by enemies, and in the 1800s. So this sort of helped build a martial spirit in Chile for national defense. And it actually inspired Chile to go through something that's called the Prussianization. So pretty much it got popular at the time with quite a few countries that if they wanted to improve their military, they should follow the Prussian example. So Chile hired people from Germany to come over, military advisors, and to basically rehaul their military up to this Prussian standard. And this can be seen today still. In Chile military parades, you can see a very strong Prussian influence that lives on to this day in Chile. So in the 1880s, Chile is using a pretty big smorgasbord of rifles. They liked the 11mm big bore rifles. They had Gras rifles. They had Beaumonts. They had Winchesters. Pretty much any gun that you could think of that existed around that black powder era, the Chileans had it. And of course, getting later on into the era of repeating rifles, around 1888. Chile decided to adopt a new repeating rifle to sort of move away from their single shots. And in 1888, they adopted the Mannlicher 1888, which is pretty much very similar to the Mannlicher 1886, but of course it's in the 8mm Mannlicher cartridge. And the Chileans are pretty happy with this. And in 1891, Chile had a civil war, which was pretty much the president and the Congress sort of had this big split. And so you have the president had the loyalty of the army, and then the Congress had the loyalty of the Navy. So in this Civil War, it was Army versus Navy, which is a pretty interesting split. In a lot of countries, there's a big rival between Army and Navy, but it got to physical conflict in Chile, and it got to a point where the Chilean Navy had to found its own army to fight the Chilean army. So there's the Congressional Chilean Navy's army fighting the presidential army. So it's a pretty neat conflict. I recommend check it out. But pretty much at the tail end of that conflict, the Chileans realized how much they were lacking in sort of modern arms and tactics. And coming out of that conflict, especially seeing their neighbors that are starting to arm up. In 1890, Argentina, they signed a contract to buy what's now we call the Argentine 1891s. They see their neighbors sort of getting these, new, arms, and that sort of forces themselves to want to get new and better arms. So you have this pretty big South American arms race where one country will buy arms and ammunition, and that forces its neighbor to, and then sort of everyone has to keep, upgrading and buying arms and ammunition. So Chile, even though they were pretty happy with the way that the Mannlicher 1888 performed, they were seeing these new Mauser rifles come out and a bunch of other rifles that were coming out at the same time, and it really piqued their curiosity. So in 1892, they held rifle trials in Paris to try to figure out which is the best one. And of all the rifles that competed, including like the Dodito, the native French design, and a bunch of other designs, the Spanish model came out on top. So this is in 1892. So the Spanish model might not be exactly what we know of as the Spanish 1893. It might have been an earlier Spanish model, But one of the things that they really liked coming out of this trial is they liked the new Mauser extractor. So that really nice long extractor that we know going from the 1893 Mausers forward. They were very impressed by that, namely because it prevented double feeds. So with the old, 1889, like Belgian and Argentine 1891 Mausers, those systems can be prone to double feeding because they're not a controlled feed. So the Chileans really liked that controlled feed. They loved the new big extractor. And they also were really big fans of the 7mm Mauser. And that's because at the time, they were looking at all these 6.5s that were coming out and all the different countries that were adopting 6.5. And they really liked that idea of moving towards that, that new, smaller, flatter shooting cartridge. Now, you would think they held a trial, the Spanish model won, and that's the end of the story. But no, with this story, there's constant infighting and back and forth. There's influence from different arms firms by sort of bribing different Chilean officials to vote for one gun or another. So there's just constant infighting in all these commissions. And even after this trial, they still really couldn't make up their mind on what gun they wanted. So in 1893, they held another trial, this time in Santiago, and the winner of that trial was the Dotato. Now the Dotato won mainly because they loved the 6.5 Dotato cartridge. They were big fans of the cartridge, so the rifle kind of won. And that's sort of like an interesting thing, like where they couldn't separate the rifle from the cartridge. But the Dotato won. So, okay, cool, another trial. You think it's no, the mine's not made up because as they find out, Peru and Bolivia are also buying arms. They're looking at getting Mausers. So now Chile is sort of looking back and they're thinking, all their sort of enemies and rivals that are surrounding them, they're all buying Mausers, so maybe there's something to that. Maybe it's sort of, they should get rid of their Mannlichers and they should go with the new Mauser rifle. And still, a bunch of infighting, a lot of people arguing with each other about what should get adopted. A lot of people with their own sort of political, agendas going back and forth pushing for different guns. And in November 1894, the president, he holds a big meeting with all the senior army officials and to discuss what new rifle. Okay, we had trials. What should we actually get? And the winner coming out of that trial was the Mauser rifle. Interestingly enough, the Mauser that they all agreed that they wanted was the 7.65 Mauser. So now that they know that they want a Mauser, they want one in 7.65, they go out and they start looking for bids. They start to seeing, they know how much they want to spend per rifle, and they start to go out to sort of figure out who can give them the best price. So at the time you have the sort of four big arms firms. So you have FN in Belgium, you have Lova, you have actual Mauser Obendorf, which Mauser Obendorf is under Lova, so it's kind of like one. And then you have OEWG and Steyr. These are pretty much the competitors to this trial, which is kind of only three. So during the negotiations, the director came from Lova, and he pretty much just convinced the Chileans outright, hey, everything you think you want the 7.65, you think you want, a rifle with all these weird features, you actually don't. What the gun that you want is the new Spanish model in 7mm Mauser. That gun is going to blow everything out of the water. And he had a really good point. The Spanish 1893, at the time of its introduction in 7mm Mauser, as probably the best bolt-action rifle in the world, with probably one of the best calibers in the world. So he had a really good point, and the Chileans were convinced. The Chileans were really smart in the way they negotiated the prices on their Mausers. They pretty much got the different companies to compete on price, and they would go to one company and they would lower their price. They'd go to the other company and give them that price. They'd lower their price. And they did that back and forth until they got what they thought was pretty much the lowest price they could, which was an offer from Lova. Of course, right after they accepted that offer, FN came with an even lower offer. But the Chileans felt a little bit more comfortable going with Lova because there were sort of patent disputes going on with FN and actually manufacturing the new 1893 system, because Lova was claiming that FN only bought the rights for the 1889 Mauser system to make that, and so they don't have the intellectual property rights over the 1893, so therefore only Lova could do it. So pretty much the Chileans adopted the Spanish 1893 with a few changes, namely the addition of a sort of third safety lug at the rear of the receiver tang, And then they adopted a bolt with a round face, which is kind of what all the Mausers used going forward, instead of one with the flat bottom of the Spanish 1893. By 1901, the Chileans bought 85,000 1895 rifles and about 25,000 carbines. Now, interestingly enough, when the Chileans were buying these guns, they heard of these rifles that were meant to go to South Africa, but because of a British blockade, they couldn't be delivered to their clients. And so these rifles actually went back to Germany. So these are the infamous Boer rifles. So about 5,800 of these Boer contract rifles that never made it to the Boer nations ended up going to Chile. And they must have got a good price on it because these Boer rifles are the 1893 pattern with the flat bottom bolt face. And it's not compatible with their other main rifles. So it's kind of interesting that they bought these two incompatible rifles. Now they're basically, they're the same caliber, basically the same rifles overall, but I don't think they were necessarily paying attention to these sort of logistical things that they were going to have in the future. They probably just were thinking, good rifles at a good price. So fast forward to 1910, the Chileans, have had their 1895s for, a good 14 years or so. They're happy with them. And in fact, some of their border conflicts are starting to heat up. So it looks like they need a bunch of new spare parts and probably new rifles to get their military in tip-top shape. So they reach out to a couple companies, and OEWG ends up winning the contract to supply the Chileans with spare parts for their 1895s. The contract included bolts, barrels, stocks, miscellaneous small parts that they needed to get their rifles into tip-top shape for what the Chileans saw as an upcoming war with their neighbors. Now there was some controversy with those parts because it turns out that DWM kind of manipulated the Chilean reception of these parts from Steyr in saying that the parts were bad. So OEWG found out that DWM was trashing these Steyr-made parts, and Steyr basically said, we're going to pull out of this agreement. So there's like a cartel going on with Mausers. It's kind of weird, there's a Mauser cartel. So Steyr was really mad, and they were going to pull out of this agreement with DWM and start to undercut them on price. DWM knew that Steyr could do that. They could make guns cheaper, so they were kind of at a disadvantage. Now, DWM was already supplying guns to most South American countries. At the time, they were pretty much at max capacity anyway, producing Brazilian 1908s. So DWM agreed to use Steyr as a subcontractor. So DWM was going to allow Steyr to produce these rifles, and in a way of sort of alleviating the negative press that Steyr got in Chile for these bad parts, DWM was going to supply some sort of quality control people. That way the Chileans felt better about the final product that they were getting. And so everything's good. So with their new rifles, the Chileans, they're not going to get their old 1895 pattern. There's been a lot of improvements to the Mauser system since the old 1895s. It's been about 12 years since the 1898 came out. So that's the action that they're looking at. That's the action that everybody's talking about, making for the Chileans, because that's what the, Chileans' neighbors are buying up. So that's what they feel like they need in order to compete with their rivals. So that's what they order. So in December 1911, the Chileans order what is to become the Model 1912. This is pretty much a pretty standard German Gewehr 98 flavored rifle. It's got a very similar H-style front band with the parade hook, very similar sling setups with the quick detach sling setup here in the rear. So the Chileans are very happy with their 1912s. They're a very good model of rifle, and in fact, they're so popular that Colombia and Mexico decide that they want 1912s, and both of those countries end up getting contracts to buy these 1912s for themselves. This is a very fantastic rifle. It's definitely one of those guns that the price of this gun does not at all reflect the quality and the craftsmanship that was put into these rifles. It's a really fine rifle, and a lot of these South American Mausers are very underappreciated, but they're very well-made guns. This was pretty much the heyday of Mauser manufacturing when just a very high level of machine work and craftsmanship went into them. So the Chileans ordered 37,500 of these long rifles, and they ordered 5,600 carbines. So that means that these Chilean 1912 carbines are pretty rare, with only 5,600 made. I really want one of those carbines. I think they're really cool guns, but I haven't found one at the right price yet. So you're probably guessing you're getting into 1912. It might have been 1913, maybe even early 1914 when these guns were delivered. It's a little bit fuzzy on the details. You can watch CN Arsenal's video on the Chilean 1912 and the 1912s in general. They do a really good job of explaining it, but pretty much we don't know if there's a second contract or not, but Austria-Hungary ended up getting a bunch of these Chilean Mausers. We don't know exactly how many, but they got a lot of these Chilean 1912s. They also got Colombian and Mexican 1912s, and they use them pretty extensively, or as extensively as they could in the war, for a rifle that's outside of their current standard issue rifle and out of their current caliber. If I was an Austro-Hungarian soldier in World War I, and the choice was either between an 1895 Mannlicher and an 8x50R and a Chilean 1912, it would be the Chilean 1912 all day long. This is pretty much the best bolt action that the Austro-Hungarians had in any sort of significant quantity during the war. Even the British had a few. The British had about 800 in their inventory whenever they took over a Chilean battleship, so even the British had some. So it's kind of weird that, that these kind of neutral-ish countries in World War I, their rifles ended up in the conflict anyway. So if you have one of these Chilean 1912s, you never know, yours could have been in World War I. So now fast forward to 1928, the Chileans once again are in the market for new Mausers. So it kind of feels like every 15 years or so, they kind of want a new batch. This time, the Chileans wanted something a little different. They actually wanted to buy, complete rifles and carbines, and then they also wanted to buy parts kits. So they wanted to buy these like Mauser barrels and receivers and all these spare parts that they could assemble themselves. It's kind of one of those interesting things. Like, a lot of countries really want domestic rifle production. They don't like necessarily depending on other countries for rifle production. So they're going to buy these parts kits and they're going to assemble them themselves, and that way they can say, that they made these guns. It's kind of a weird thing, if you're buying all the parts and assembling it. It's kind of like an AR-15, you don't really build an AR-15, you just assemble it from parts that somebody made. So after a lot of negotiations with Mauser, so actual Mauser Obendorf now, so we're not talking about DWM or Lova or any of those things. We're talking about the Mauser Obendorf company post World War I. They sign a contract with Mauser for the production of a whole bunch of rifles and parts kits and everything. Interestingly enough, Mauser Obendorf did not ask for a down payment on any of these guns. Instead, they said, fine, we'll make them, you pay for them whenever you get them. So this new Chilean gun is actually going to be called the model of 1929. And so the Chileans signed a contract with Mauser Obendorf, actual Mauser Obendorf, not DWM, for these new model of 1929s. Mauser gears up to make them, and then they sort of find a big mistake that they made during the contract of this gun. Mauser gets tooled up, they invest a lot of their own money and take a lot of expenses into making these Mausers, and then Chile backs out of the contract. They just say, oh, sorry, a lot of these crazy things are happening back home, we can't afford to buy these. But they sign the contract. So Mauser's in this really difficult position where they're already struggling coming out of World War I, and then they had to invest a lot of money into getting, set up to make these new guns. So Mauser's kind of in this weird position where they kind of have to sue and really push the Chileans pretty hard in order to get this contract, in order to get at least some of these expenses reimbursed. So now a lot of negotiations went back and forth between Mauser and the Chilean government. So in 1935, Chile and Mauser came to this agreement where Chile would pay, compensation for the cancellation of this contract, and then they were also going to order some new carbines and some new ammunition. Now, they were sort of, in Mauser's eyes, they were part of the same deal because, yeah, they're going to get some compensation for the expenses that they took in, but they lose the contract to make all those rifles. So to Chile, they're going to order some new carbines, and that'll kind of help make up the difference. Mauser just sort of, took it as being maybe the best that they could get out of the situation, and they agreed. Interestingly enough, Chile, they wanted the compensation to be kept secret. They only wanted Mauser to just sort of say, hey, we came to an agreement, we're going to sell Chile some new carbines, and it was all good. But Chile did pay a compensation to Mauser, and Mauser ended up making this new 1935 rifle for the Chileans. Now, this rifle wasn't ordered just for the whole Chilean military. This rifle was ordered especially for the Chilean carabineros. Ian has a pretty good video on this rifle if you want to check that out as well, because there's not too much content about the 1935 out there. Overall, I think that this is probably, based on just purely on features, that this is one of the best Mauser rifles ever made, maybe even one of the best bolt-action rifles ever made, just based on overall features and handling and everything. I'm a really big fan of this 1935. Now, the Chileans only ordered 10,000 of these, which, is not as much as the original contract was going to be for that model 1929. But, any work is better than no work, I guess, to Mauser, so they agreed to make these guns. So it's interesting. We now have 3 different Chilean Mausers that are made by 3 different companies and 2 different countries. So there's a pretty, neat amount of diversity between the different Chilean Mausers. I prefer the 1935 over the 1912 carbine, mainly because of the side sling placement. The 1912 carbine only takes the sling underside. Interestingly enough, this 1935, it has sling placements for both, but you can't remove the quick detach sling from the side to put it anywhere else, because they sort of put this saddle ring on it. So that cancels the quick detach, but it has a quick detach sling that's not quick detachable. So one of the most notable things about the 1935 is probably this front sight. And most notably, this front sight borrows very heavily from the K31 front sight. It's a little bit different, but it's very, very similar in the way that the front sight post is in a diagonal dovetail with these in the shape of these front sight ears that protect the sight. This is very similar to the Swiss K31, and it kind of makes sense because whenever the Chileans initially approached Mauser to make their Model 1929s, Mauser really was having difficulty in going to make them. So Mauser actually went to SIG in Switzerland and looked for them to make these Mausers for the Chilean government. At first, SIG was on board with that, and then they ended up backing out, which is a little unfortunate because that would have been amazing to have a SIG-made Chilean Mauser. That would have been really cool, and just having a new model of Mauser, that's all fantastic. But alas, it didn't happen. But I kind of have a feeling that somehow between Mauser Obendorf and SIG talking, and maybe being in Switzerland and seeing guns, I bet Mauser picked up this front sight post idea from the K31 whenever they're in Switzerland and sort of doing this negotiation with SIG. But as far as Chile and buying Mausers, this is pretty much it. Of course, this is a model of 1935. So, this was delivered, in the mid to later 1930s from Germany. We kind of know what happens a little bit after that in Europe. So this is kind of it as far as, the Mauser rifles that Chile is buying. Now, Chile did go through a program, and they rebarreled or rechambered their Mausers to the new 7.62. So now we're going to fast forward for the last time to the 1950s. Of course, we have the NATO alliances, sort of against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so Chile is finding itself, on the NATO side of that. And they're going to adopt the new 7.62 by 51 caliber and replace their 7mm Mauser cartridge, which is, in my opinion, it's not a really good trade. I would have much rather have stuck with the 7mm Mauser. But of course, they're getting up to that NATO standard. And interestingly, they're one of the few countries that actually converted their Mausers into this new 7.62 by 51 NATO round. These rifles are a lot of times called the Chilean 1261s or 1912-61. for the original 1912s and when the conversion was done. So if you are looking for a Mauser that's in a lot more readily available cartridge, that might be a good Mauser for you to look forward to collecting. Me personally, I'd rather just keep it in the original cartridge, but apparently the 1912s are perfectly safe to shoot in 7.62s, so it's up to you and what you like. They also converted 95s. They converted earlier Mausers to the 7.62 as well, and those are a little iffy. I wouldn't want to necessarily shoot those, so I would tend to shy away from the 1895s that are converted. Just try to stick with the original 7mm. It's a great cartridge, but I know some people like to only collect guns in a single caliber, for logistics with ammunition, and I completely get that. But, there is some variation. Now let's do some close-ups of the rifles. Here we have all three rifles, top to bottom, the 1895, the 1912, and the 1935. So of course this 1895 uses the earlier cock-on-close action, like the Spanish 1893. It's pretty much very similar to what a lot of the other countries had around the time period. And then when they moved to the 1912, they of course moved to the Mauser 98 action, which is a cock-on opening action. Of course, there's a lot of debate between cock-on open versus cock-on closed, but just based on the popularity of this cock-on open action, kind of seems like cock-on open is probably better. Now, the 1895 receivers were blued, where the 1912 receivers were left in the white. This is really a beautiful Mauser here, left in the white. Of course, a nice bluing can be really beautiful as well. Just kind of interesting that they switched from bluing to just being in the white. And then they switched back to bluing with the 1935. This might have just been in vogue at the time to leave the receivers in the white, so that's probably why they did it. Rear sights are different too. They went from this older style of flip-up ladder sight to just this tangent sight that's not really meant to be used flipping up. Probably the better sight and what everyone went to eventually. Now, besides finish and markings, it's really hard to tell a difference between the 1912 and the 1935. And I don't know if this has ever been done on camera, so I'm going to try to switch the bolts. So here's the 1935 bolt going in the 1912, and it feels a little rough. Like it feels like it's not really meant to go in there, but it does actually work. And let's see, and the 1912 bolt goes into the 1935. So that's kind of a different thing. Now, when they moved to the 98 pattern, they also adopted this stock disc. It's even carried over here on the 1935. Typically, these are meant to put information about the rifle, so say where it was issued or what company it was in, something like that. But these are both blank, so it's kind of like they ordered it to use and then they never really use it, because I haven't seen any of these with actual Chilean markings. Maybe there are out there, I just haven't seen any. So here we have a Chilean crest, and underneath that is 1895. Here's a really nice preserved Chilean crest. So it's a Chilean crest in 1912, and boy is this stock beautiful. And then we have a pretty worn off cartouche here in 1935. Not surprising that this is worn off. These saw pretty good usage with the Carabineros, which is a cavalry type of police unit. So of course this stock is going to be a little bit more worn probably. Now the neat thing for U.S. collectors is that if a gun is made by Lova, so Lova was dissolved before 1898, so if a gun is made by Lova, then it is an antique gun, so we know that this gun was made before 1898. We have a nice little Chilean crest on top here. Now for the 1912 here on the side, we got Waffen Fabrik Steyr in Austria. Here we have the beautiful Chilean crest and Modelo 1912 on it. This gun is in particularly nice shape. And you can see how shiny this receiver is because the bolt and receiver was left in the white. So now for the 1935, we have the Mauser Obendorf on the side of the receiver. So this is made actually by Mauser. Some slightly different markings on this gun for the serial. Here on the back we have this really nice Mauser logo, which is really cool if you're like a Mauser fan and like guns with that on it. And here we have the Chilean Carabineros crest. Underneath that, Modelo 1935. There's a Swiss K31 on the bottom here now, and we can see how this front sight is worked. So it has these, these nice front sight protectors on the side, and we can see a very similar sort of setup. And with both, you have that diagonal track for the front sight to go in. So guys, if you like Chilean Mausers and maybe you want to learn more about them than was in this video, or if you just want to learn a lot of the backstory behind, what was going on in Chile and Europe at the time, and some of the conflicts that are going on between the different companies as they sort of compete for the Chilean contract, check out this book, The History of the Mauser Rifle in Chile. It is a fantastic book, not that expensive. I would say this is probably one of the best Mauser books that I own, and I'll put a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. I highly recommend this book. Thank you guys for watching like always, and I'll see you next time.